I'm so excited to have our next guest, Andrea Chilcote, on the Tiffany Kobashigawa podcast. As the founder and CEO of Morningstar Ventures, Andrea leads the organization from the foundation of nearly 3 decades of experience in the organizational development, coaching, and consulting field. And Andrea has also written a book called What Leaders Need Now. And I can't wait to speak with her about the book. I hope you enjoy Andrea and the message she has to share as much as I do. Welcome, Andrea, and thank you for being here.
Stephanie, I am delighted to be here, and I am so excited that you're bringing leadership and management into a focus on health and wellness. It is so important that we do that, and I love your mission.
Oh, thank you so much. I think the work that you're doing is spectacular in this space. And I just want to dive right in and start with like your why and then work ourselves into specifics. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, perfect. So, among other details regarding your work, I'm perhaps most intrigued by why, like why you've written your book, "What Leaders Need Now," or said differently, why have you taken this moment in time to write "What Leaders Need Now," and what outcome do you intend to provoke from your writing?
Great question. So, when in March of 2020, right before you know what was about to happen, the pandemic was about to hit or had hit, everyone was fragile. Anxiety, stress, burnout were very high. Now they would get higher. Every survey you read, every study that's done shows that they have gotten higher and have stayed high, but they were high at record highs. Employee engagement was low. Cultural, social, racial, gender issues and opportunities were everywhere. We were at a breaking point. Then we had a crisis, a significant crisis that fell upon us. And that was a moment. And I intend to take advantage of that moment because we've had a learning, and that learning has been extraordinary. And we cannot miss this learning that we've had.
So, I have not thought about it that way because I think a lot of us can't remember before the pandemic, right? Like, what was life like before? So, you just reminded me that we did have life before. And why do you think, and what were the reasons why we were at such a dire state before the pandemic happened? And I just want to pause because this is something new. I wasn't really going to dive into like life before the pandemic, right? But since you brought it up and it's so important and impactful, what was going on that made us so um, so vulnerable at the beginning before the pandemic?
Well, what was going on has been going on for decades. And you mentioned that I'd been doing this work for 30 years. When I started my business, I thought very naively that it had a shelf life of maybe 5 or 10 years because I thought we would change the way leaders and managers approached their work. I thought that a lot of the work that was done in the 70s around open dialogue and shifting the way we communicated in the workplace, the way we treated people, um, some driven by social and cultural movements, that it would change the way workplaces were and how they existed. And it was very naive and hierarchical, authoritative practices in organizations did not shift, and pressures on employees have only increased. And we were reaching a breaking point and we weren't really doing anything about it. And that is what was going on. So when we say what do leaders need now, which I know we'll get into what those things are, they're not any different now than they were before the pandemic.
Yeah.
But they've been highlighted by the pandemic.
Okay. Understood. All right. Thank you for bringing us back. So, can you tell our listeners how and why you've come to the conclusion that leaders need to show compassion, courage, and humility through their ability to develop, reflect, and acknowledge? Like, how did you get there out of all the work that you've done?
It was a process that we began right away. My colleagues and I, we immediately said, what do people need? What do leaders need? What do their teams need? What do their employees need? What do leaders and people at all levels need? And it was very clear that we all they needed support, listening, compassion, understanding. No one knew what to do, where to turn. People had a lot going on in their lives and at work. And so what did they need from leaders? Leaders needed to be, to make a label that's generic, they needed to have emotional intelligence. So they needed self-awareness to get themselves through what was going on. They needed to be able to separate their own needs and emotions from others. They needed empathy for others and what that really was. That's not an easy one. They needed to be able to listen without problem solving because no one could solve the problems. So we started to work with our own clients, our own teams, and observe and study. And we started to research and study what others were doing and look at what was working in organizations that were doing it well and doing it right. We started doing our own work and look at what was working and working well. And so that was what really gave birth to compassion. Courage was an easy one. You didn't have to look far to see how important courage was, not just with organizations that were providing essential services, if you will. Healthcare was an organization. I worked a lot in healthcare, do work a lot in healthcare. And so that was an easy one, but not even in healthcare. There were courageous decisions that had to be made at all levels of all organizations. So that was an easy one that was highlighted. Humility was harder to label, but it became apparent when you break down its component parts. Humility being defined by needing to ask for help, accept help, the vulnerability to admit mistakes, make mistakes, the whole servant leader construct, being able to put your needs beneath others, subordinate your needs to other people and serve versus being self-serving. That's where that came to be.
And do you think that because of the default in the workplace that had been for so long is what was maybe stopping this work from happening, right? Because I think what you've coined is kind of a revolution, if you will. It's a movement, right? To have emotional intelligence, to have courage and empathy, all of this servant leader, that's a movement. So do you think that the default of who was in charge at the time, do you think that, or for the most part, do you think that that was really in the way and helped perpetuate?
And I think it's still there. I don't think we've had the revolution, Tiffany.
Okay.
And I think it's an interesting word to use. I'm not alone in this. So this isn't Andrea's idea. The book is based in a tremendous amount of research, thought leaders that that have gone before me coined these traits. There is so much. There's so much. So many people write about, talk about, work in organizations, and so many organizational leaders display these traits and try to make those part of the fabric of cultures. And that's why I say these are not new.
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying to get these to be part of how we behave. But you're right that they're not there. So there is a prevailing. I go back to the 1950s theory X, theory Y um, leadership or management model.
Mm-hmm.
There are still a lot of theory X managers out there,
Yeah.
and they still are alive and well and leading our organizations.
Yeah. I remember growing up and like Lee Iacocca was like the big thing. I'm dating myself. Oh my gosh. But seriously, do you know just that kind of brass, direct, my way or highway? I get results, very results driven. And what is it? The ends justify the means. Uh, and then the default was also, largely white male. So you don't question that authority that's been kind of ruling, especially corporate America, but all over the world, right? But especially in corporate America, you just kind of don't question that. And I think that's where I was trying to get to. And so if you look at, like you said, others have been talking about the servant leadership, and Brene Brown, who I think we both love, acknowledges that you can't be a good leader and basically just a good human being until you allow yourself to be vulnerable. And leading with courage and being a servant leader means that you are vulnerable, right? And so the default has been white male who's not been able to be seen as vulnerable or not allowed himself to be seen as vulnerable. But as we get more leaders in positions of power who are not that default and are opening up to say it's okay to be vulnerable, and you get people like researchers like Brene Brown to say vulnerability is how you get to courage, then I think that's what I've been seeing as a shift. And that's what I mean by a movement, because you do hear it. It wasn't even talked about before, right? So do you think that maybe plays into what we're seeing?
Everything you're saying. So last week I had a conversation with someone about not questioning authority. So it's alive and well and in in organizations. So we don't question authority here. It is not safe. So absolutely. And the fact is that it sometimes isn't safe. So there is fear of vulnerability that is it, vulnerability can be learned, it can be coached, it can be brought out in people, it can be nurtured, and it can be a good thing. And that can be a white male, it can be anyone else
Yeah,
who can
absolutely.
learn to do that,
Hmm.
because a white male might be culturally trained that that's just not a good thing and not what he's supposed to do.
Yeah,
But it can also be unsafe for anyone.
yeah,
And if it's unsafe, I'm not, as a coach, going to say, well, you should just go on out there and do it,
yeah,
because it literally, in many of our organizations, can cost him or her their job.
yeah.
And that's not okay. And that's why I love your word revolution, because it's not okay that that still exists.
And why do you think, I'm kind of going off script. I have questions I want to ask you, so we'll go back to that. But I want to pick up on this because it's a natural part of our conversation right now. Why do you think that we're saying now that it's not okay? Right? So it hasn't been okay for a very long time. There are a lot of things in our society that haven't been okay, that are not okay. And as we kind of break down some of these, I don't know, traditions and the default, even though you get people who don't necessarily look like what the default has looked like, they still act like that, right? Because that's how we've been taught. So there certainly is opening up, but then there's that mindset. So why do you think there's a shift now to where we are moving in a different direction? What's the change?
I think it's a convergence of so many things. And I think the pandemic is just one. I started with that. because that was for me and for my colleagues a catalyst for this thinking and this work and this research because of the work we do.
Mm-hmm.
Our work changed overnight. But I think it's a convergence of the generations, the social justice situations, political situations, the way we work that has changed permanently based on the pandemic. And anybody who thinks that that's not the case doesn't have their eyes open. The way we work has changed. And I don't mean that we're not going to ever go back to the office. I just mean the way we worked has changed. There are things that have innovation has happened, things have changed. So there's a convergence of so many things. And we have reached a tipping point of burnout, stress, and people are at their last nerve in many ways. Yeah. So I think that's it. It's not an easy answer, but it's a lot of things all together at once.
I think that is the answer. I think you're right. And I think that may be what you meant in your book. I just want to read, there's a great quote that you have, and there are a few that I want to read, but this one is, people who have grown, honed, and nurtured compassion, courage, humility are able to do so because they do the work to develop themselves as a leader. I don't know if you wanted to respond to that at all.
I make a point in the book of saying that these three qualities are not skills to go take a class and learn in a class. And that seems odd coming from someone who's spent her life work as a leadership development consultant or expert. And what I mean by that, I don't mean that we can't learn to be better at those things, but these are intrinsic qualities. These are not skills or tools. Mm-hmm. We all have them inside of us. And if we're not displaying them, I think it's either because we've lost our way or we haven't done the work. We haven't brought them out in us. And bringing them out doesn't mean you learn a technique. It means that you do some really hard introspection and some hard work.
And these things kind of become second nature, become part of you, and not just a thing that you do to check the box, but really changes you in some kind of fundamental way. You said something else too. I've got another quote, but before we go there, you said something else too in our conversation. You said something about problem solving, and you said that's not what we're trying to do. I've been doing some introspective work myself, and that's one of the things that the coach that I've been working with on that work said, we have to tame the problem-solving monsters as leaders and empower the people that we lead to make decisions and problem solve for themselves. And I think that's one of the hardest things, because we just want to get them like, well, what do you need? Well, let's figure it out. And it's for them to figure out. It's our job as leaders to ask the right questions that will open up and facilitate their aha moments, their problem solving. But another thing you said too is, I think people are afraid to, because if I do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing, then it's all, I could be fired. So people are kind of afraid to do that self-exploration, because work is not about me and my self-exploration or my needs or what I want. It's just, tell me what you need me to do so I can do the job. So I just wanted to pause, because I thought that was very on par with some of the other stuff that I've been reading and the introspective work that I've been doing. So I just wanted to put that out there. There's another quote in your book that I love, and I'd like to read it now. Organizations that see people as only as resources to be utilized in the service of productivity or providing the organization are losing employees. Wow. And through the message of your book, you advocate for that changing, right? So do you see that changing for the better sooner or later?
Well, if I didn't see it changing, I would have no hope for the future. And I probably wouldn't get hired to do the work that I do if there weren't organizations who didn't subscribe to the philosophies that I'm talking about here. So I do see it changing. I do see it getting better. I know there are pockets and organizations and industries even that don't subscribe to that.
Yeah.
And it will take people refusing to give in to that.
Yeah.
Um, it will take people taking a stand for their lives and what's important to them. And they are losing people. They are losing people who refuse to go along with with that.
Okay. Okay. That's I think you're right. And so as employees, we, like you said, need to make that sacrifice in order for it to get better for ourselves and for future, right? For future generations is what it sounds like. And so,
Yes, but Tiffany, leaders have a responsibility. So I think it is a dual responsibility, but leaders and especially executive leaders have a responsibility. And when I talk in the book about courage, I make a distinction between two things. And I think it's really important. The courage that people display every day when they take a stand about how they're willing to be treated, how they're willing to stand up for what's right,
mhm,
for themselves, for their customers, to adhere to the values of the organization, their personal values, being vulnerable. That is the work of a coach to help people do that.
yeah,
That is part of courage. And there's another kind of courage, and that's reserved for those people who have positions of authority, positional authority such that they can take a stand in a way that impacts people's lives, organizational values, the kinds of things we're talking about here in terms of how people are treated, how cultures get shaped,
mhm,
how organizations get results, and also people are nurtured and supported and treated well. And not every employee can do that. And I think that's an important part of courage too. And there's organizations who have senior executives who are doing that.
yeah.
And some of those are organizations that people like us work with because they see the value in this kind of work.
And it's really an individual act, um, sometimes, right? To line up as an individual, to adhere to the corporate culture, but then also, like you said, remind maybe um, executives that there are values that they're supposed to be upholding, right? And lining up with. So,
Yeah.
Dr. George Storm, who is also an executive coach, like yourself, as well as the global head of IT infrastructure at Mercedes-Benz Mobility, says that there are 9 toxic workplace behaviors that we need to stop. And I think we're getting into that. And so this would be a really good time to talk about these 9. And I would love to get your feedback. And what he says is that we need to stop normalizing these 9 things in the workplace. And I'd like to read those now and then get your response. I have how I feel about them, but let's see how you feel. So working 24/7, or I would say well, he is working 24/7. I would say thinking the expectation that you work 24/7, but he is working 24/7. Micromanagement, working overtime as a requirement or a condition of employment, right? Like if it comes up, if they need you to do that, you have to do it no matter what. Employers expecting you to drop everything immediately to respond. Like I'm asking you to do something. I sent you an email 2 minutes ago. Didn't you see it? And why aren't you working on it already? Working without breaks. This was something really interesting. I have to remember that we still do. Falling into gender stereotypes when it comes to distribution of duties. For example, women expected to take on the note-taking duties during meetings, regardless of their actual title. And I've seen this where VPs, because that VP is a woman, you expect that person to moderate or,
Wants
be,
to flip chart the notes.
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes, or,
Yes.
or to take notes. Um, Replacing actual benefits for perks that nobody really wants or needs, right? I don't need a foosball. I can buy my own lunch, right? Like cover my healthcare. Results about everything of results above everything else. Always having a false sense of urgency. Putting results driven culture above everything else simply for the sake of going fast without thinking or truly possessing a strategic focus or vision for the work that's being done. And then number 9 is busyness. Employers who would rather have performative business results as a status for individuals or departments rather than sustainable and tangible ideas and initiatives. So that's a lot there to kind of unpack. But how do you feel about those?
Well, it's hard to stay motivated and positive listening to that list, but it's why we do the work we do,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Whew, that's quite a list.
Well, any of
And
them,
they're all alive and well.
any of them stick out? Micromanagement, working 24/7. And again, these are just the expectations, right? Of that working without breaks.
All alive and well. They're all out there.
Yeah,
And one of the things I'm struck by is how we generalize because they're all alive and well. And they're not all in every leader, they're all in every organization, but they're not in every department or in every function. So it comes down to the leader.
yeah,
It's like there are leaders who require 24/7 work or who micromanage, and the leader the next door down doesn't.
yeah. That's true. Is this feeding into what people say? Um, People don't leave organizations; they leave managers.
Yeah,
Okay,
that's right.
yeah. So what you're saying then is this isn't necessarily a toxic culture. Those 9 kind of activities or expectations define a toxic leader. And then the culture is
They
when they
do.
perpetuate and allow that leader. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and you have enough of them, it becomes a culture.
Yeah. True. True, true, true. Um so why do you suppose that we have collectively allowed toxic environments and leaders to persist for so long? So wholly unchecked, right? So you address it in the section of the book about history of fear, I think, but can you expand on that?
It is fear, and fear. Then you could make a list of fear of what. And I think you have to separate fear into two things. There's personal fear, and so you think about there are so many leaders that you can have a completely unconscious leader who would say there's nothing wrong with some of these things, and there's not a lot I could do about that as a coach. More often, I deal with people who are really, truly dealing with a dilemma where they say, I see the problem and I don't know what to do about it. And to an outsider, that would be kind of obvious like, well, you solve the problem. That person shouldn't be allowed to manage a team if they're creating this kind of situation. But they have a fear. So do they have an internal fear of admitting their own error strategically, judgment? They hired them, allowed it to go on. They've condoned it. They've given them positive performance reviews for how many years. They're their buddy on the golf course, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Or is there a very real marketplace situation? Are they going to lose customers if they move that person out or to another role or out of the business? Are they going to have a legal problem because they haven't addressed this problem for years and years? It's really complex.
It is, but
And
I've seen it where the whole department is just suffering
Mhm.
under a specific leader, and just the entire, like, I don't know, 20 people, 25 people. And it seems like sometimes the organization would sacrifice those 25 people rather than remove that one toxic leader. And like you said, it's for a myriad of reasons. I just over and over and over and over and over and over have seen it, and was having a conversation with somebody who works in healthcare, and he said, he's a professor, and he said that it's really prevalent in healthcare and that we have to address that issue. I just don't know how is that gonna happen? How
this
is
is
it gonna
where
get better?
I don't have a pat answer for you by any means, but this is where I think we have that coming together of the two kinds of courage,
Hmm.
because it's courage on the part of the person who holds positional authority, and it's also courage on the part of those who could open up and be vulnerable and authentic and honest. And there is a reticence to be open and direct also on the part of those 20 people sometimes. You've probably experienced that as well.
Yeah.
They tolerate, oftentimes they tolerate versus bringing to the forefront problems that could be solved. Would you agree?
I would, and I think that's what we were talking about before, right? Because at some point as an employee, you have to say enough is enough. And that might mean that you sacrifice your standing in the organization, you sacrifice your job, maybe. And I think that's one of the reasons why I am so hopeful of this, generations that are coming after. So, I'm a Gen Xer. We're used to kind of lining up and doing whatever we were told. Just, okay, it just is what it is. This is the way it is. And I think we kind of just didn't question. We got into the workforce because our whole goal was to get a good job so we can take care of ourselves. We kind of were unruly and raised ourselves anyway as Gen Xers in the 80s, just kind of doing it. Um, and we just made it work. We just figured it out. And I think this generation coming behind and coming up and moving into the ranks are saying that's not good enough. Like, you have to question and say no. Like, why is it this way? Why do you need me come in the office so I can sit and be on a Zoom with the rest of my people who are in their offices, half here, half. Like, why are these requirements this way? Why is it this way? So I think they're questioning and then saying, this doesn't work for me. And I think you were getting to it before. We were seeing this kind of questioning before, right? The pandemic. But then I think the pandemic just it answered a lot of, well, the world is not going to stop necessarily because we don't fall into these hierarchical norms. And we did figure out, like, oh, what would happen if I lose my job? Like, what's next, right? Like, what would happen? And like, those of us who survived. So now I think the kind of great unknown of what's going to happen if I'm not working every second of my day. I think we've kind of fought those fears, and I think we're better for it. So I think this younger generation, I hate to sound so cliche, but I really do think that they're going to save us from ourselves. Um,
Right.
at the very least, right? They're going to make us question where maybe we didn't question authority, and we just fed into it. And we see it so much, and it's not just in the workplace, right? So we see it in terms of, for here in America, we see that as the American dream, right? Owning a home, right? Now it's like getting into debt. This generation, they don't want to do all that. They want experiences, and it's about their people, their friends. It's about experiences. And so they would spend money on travel, dinners, things that bring people together. I think it's a value shift. And they're not owning homes the way that, they're just not buying into the American dream the way that I think the Gen Xers and above bought into the American dream. And I think that's in corporate America too. Would you agree? Am I off with that, you think?
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
And to the extent that we are not listening, we're going to get left behind.
absolutely. And you see that as a theme woven throughout, right? Your book is, if you don't do these things, I guarantee you're going to get left behind. And then you give us anecdotes for why that's true. And it's one of the reasons why I love the book so much. So let me ask you, I'd like to walk us back just a little bit, if that's okay. How did you get started, right? So we're talking about your book, and you've got, 3 decades of experience, and, we're talking about all these ideas back and forth, but I'd like to get to know you just a little bit more as an executive coach, right? Do you remember your first client or the most impactful client? Like, how did you get started in the first place?
Well, if you want to go visit my website, I tell the story of how I got started. Way back when I was a little girl, I used to come home from school and teach my dolls what I learned in school. And every experience I had in my young adult life was some form of teaching or coaching.
Yeah.
So I've been a coach naturally, I would say, all of my life until I formally started my business in the early 90s. And I started my business doing leadership development work, teaching leadership curriculum, and had this very naive notion when I started that I would change the world. Learned really fast that that wasn't possible.
Mm-hmm.
And it became really clear that my job wasn't to change organizations, it was to help people transform.
Mm.
And then it became really clear, I've been doing this a long time. I started coaching before executive coaching was anywhere close to as popular as it is today.
Yeah.
It became really clear working with people one-on-one in particular, and teams as well, was the way to help people make change. And that became my work. I have a lot of early memories. When you ask that question, I think about the very first person I worked with, which was, we all have those people we worked with for free when we first started. I remember somebody I worked with and helped her. I know I helped her tremendously. I don't, I don't know that I knew what I was doing at the time, but I know I helped her.
Yeah.
I have a memory that I could tell you a quick story that I think is relevant to the
Please.
things that we're talking about here,
Mm-hmm.
that has to do with people aspect of leadership inside of a person who's very focused on business results and getting things done for his organization. And I'll use his first name. If he hears this, I haven't been in touch with him for quite a while. If he hears this and knows that, I'm only saying really great things about him. It's been a long time since I worked with him. I remember having a conversation with my client, Ralph. He was a senior executive at the time, but he was being asked to take a very big leap senior executive to I think a senior vice president of a huge region of his organization.
Mm-hmm.
And his only hesitation was he was a people person.
Mm.
And he knew people at the front line of his organization, and they loved him. He knew their parents. He'd go to, if somebody had a wedding, a funeral, he'd go.
Mm.
He knew their families. He knew their brothers and sisters, not in a inappropriate go out and have a drink with them on the weekend way, but in a just a caring way. And he was just extremely successful. He got the best results in the organization. He moved very quickly up in the corporation. And he was afraid that as a senior executive, he would lose that people connection and be in an office in an ivory tower.
Mm-hmm.
And I suggested to him that he would have even more influence over the way people were treated in his organization if he could influence more senior leaders in that way.
Yeah.
And he took the job, and he was very successful in that job. And I was not in touch with him for a number of years, but I knew he was what geographical area he was over as a senior executive. And later, a few years ago, I was working on a program where I was assigned an emerging leader. He was a senior director that he was in a vice president training program, if you will, for another organization. He was just a new hire. And he had come from that region where my former client Ralph had been.
Mm-hmm.
Now, he would have been many levels below Ralph in
Mm-hmm.
this organization. And I said, by the way, did you know Ralph? And he says, Ralph, oh, my man. He says, got out his phone. He said, got his number on speed dial in my cell phone.
Wow.
He's the best leader. And I thought, Ralph never lost his connection.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And here he is building leaders.
Yeah.
And that is a person who knew the power of the people connection.
Yeah.
And he got results for his company. And he got it through that people connection.
Yeah.
And he taught other people how to do it. And
'Cause
we
it-
had a nice long chat. Go ahead.
Oh no, I interrupted you. I'm sorry, Andrea.
We had a nice long chat about how Ralph did that at a level, many levels below, but he knew the influence that he had on his people leadership.
I think that's such an amazing story. Sorry, I got really, really excited because what you're saying is this is a really good example of how I bet people could care less what they were selling, what they were making, and the results that he was able to get is because he really did care and they were working for him, not so much the organization, right? He could have been doing anything at any place and he would have been successful because of that attitude.
Right.
And I wonder why he felt empowered to be the way that he was. And I wonder if some leaders now don't feel empowered to make those connections. I wonder what it is about the Ralphs that makes them the way that they are. And not that you have to be exactly like Ralph. And I don't think that you're saying that. I think you're sharing a story of an extraordinary person. But we all have the capacity to lead and have and inspire people to be their best. But why do you think so few of us do?
I get back to compassion, courage, and humility, and Ralph embodies those things.
Okay.
And I think we all have the raw material to do that. But what are we afraid of? Why haven't we developed those things? And that is the question. I believe we can. I really do.
And I think it goes back to what you're saying, the developing yourself and being self-aware, acknowledging who you are and doing that work, really. And I wonder if people are put in leadership positions just because they fit whatever default, they were successful at the job or whatever it is, and they're not really ready for leadership, or they don't really want leadership. They just want the paycheck. It's the ego. It's the opposite of all the stuff that you were saying, right? It's the opposite of humility, of compassion and courage.
Mm.
Hmm.
Great conversation, Tiffany.
Yeah, it's just one that we should always just be having, because I think as a leader, you don't understand that you are sometimes are in control of people's lives and livelihoods and how they move about in the world. You know what I'm saying? Anyway, okay. So do you ever work with organizations who you feel just aren't committed to the type of call to action that you're working on with individuals? Right. And then if so, how do you get around that? And I would imagine it would, you would make it more about the individual than the work, or than the organization, right? I think that's what you're saying, is that it really comes down to an individual thing, regardless of how much support you get from an organization.
Yeah. There are certainly times when people want to check the box with this kind of work.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't usually last very long. I seek to find what the individual wants and wants to get from the work. But those usually don't turn into long-term relationships.
Mm-hmm.
There's just not anything tangible to hold on to.
Yeah.
I usually can detect that pretty early on.
If they're just checking the box, like corporate says, we have to go through this training, we have to offer it. We've come to you. We heard you're great, but here are some people. But they're just not really. They're just going through the motions. I would imagine that the work that you do, even if that is the case from a corporate standpoint, that you probably find some individuals who still, right, absorb it and take advantage of it and love the opportunity and see the executive coaching opportunity for what it really is to become a better leader.
And that's why it is focused on individual change leaders. It's about changing individuals. It's not changing organizations. And then those individuals change cultures, and then changed cultures change organizations.
I love
That's
that.
how it works.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Okay. So, Andrea, if people want to get a hold of you and your book and to book you for a session or to book you to come, speak to their organization, is it best to visit your website, which I think is morningstarventures.com?
Correct. Yes. Would love to be in touch.
Okay, great. Morningstarventures.com. Before we close out our conversation, if you could summarize what clients should glean from a coaching session, the most valuable aspect of coaching, right, from your perspective, what would you say that is?
Well, coaching is about change. Coaching is about transformation that's positive. So if you're wanting to go somewhere, if you're wanting to get to something, even if you don't know what that destination is, if you don't know what that vision is, coaching is about either having a vision that you want to realize and needing a guide to help you walk along the way, or having a guide to help you craft a vision. It may be about bringing out the best in what you know are your strengths, or transforming things that you perceive as things that are not strengths and working through that. I serve as a guide to help people along that kind of a path. That's what coaching is about and for.
I love that. And I love your message. Again, if you'd like to book Andrea for an individual coaching session or for your organization to speak, please visit morningstarventures.com. Thank you so much for being here today, Andrea.
Thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.
This has been an episode of the Tiffany Kobashigawa podcast. We hope we shared information that you find helpful to increasing your individual overall health and wellness and the health and wellness of those within your community.